The wind in Dusty Basin carried the scent of sage and resignation. It was early autumn in Wyoming, 1889, a season when the very air seemed brittle enough to snap. Red dust, fine as milled flour, settled on every surface, coating the worn leather of Eden Quinn's boots and clinging to the hem of her homespun dress. It was a constant, gritty reminder of the ground they stood on, ground that could give or take with equal indifference. From her seat by the cabin's single window, Eden guided a needle through a thick cotton shirt, her stitches small and even, a line of perfect discipline against the unruly world outside. This work, sewing for the innkeeper, was one of the many threads she wove together to keep their life from unraveling. The other was Jessie. Her brother sat at the far end of the small room, a piece of charcoal clutched in his long fingers. He was 16, with a man's height but a boy's frightened eyes. A sketchbook lay open on his lap, but his hand was still. He was listening to the silence, waiting for it to be broken. The collapse at the Black Creek mine had stolen his peace 6 months ago, leaving him with a terror of any sudden sound. It was Eden's primary goal, more vital than putting food on the table, to mend that broken peace, to find a way to quiet the echoes in his head. Her other, more immediate goal was to simply keep this roof over their heads. The sound of an approaching horse made Jessie flinch, his knuckles turning white around the charcoal. Eden paused her sewing, her own body tensing in response to his, "It's just a rider, Jess, nothing more." But it was not just any rider. The man who dismounted was Silas Granger, a man whose polished boots seemed to repel the red dust that clung to everyone else. He was the town's banker and its foremost landowner, a spider who sat at the center of a web of debts and deeds. He did not knock but simply stepped onto their porch, his shadow falling across the room. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone, "I trust I find you well." Eden set her sewing aside and rose, moving to stand between Granger and her brother. "Mr. Granger, what can we do for you?" Granger's eyes swept the humble cabin, lingering for a moment on Jessie, who had curled in on himself, trying to become invisible. "It is a matter of business. A note left by your father. I'm afraid it has come due." He produced a folded paper from the inside pocket of his tailored coat. 30 days. The terms are quite clear. The house, the land, the stable, everything stands as collateral. 30 days. The words landed like stones in the quiet room. It was an impossible sum, an insurmountable mountain. Her father had taken the loan for seed and equipment the spring before he died, a gamble on a good harvest that never came. "We will find a way," Eden said, her voice betraying none of the cold dread that was seeping into her bones. She would not give him the satisfaction. Granger smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "I am sure you will try. The railroad has an interest in this valley. You know, progress is coming to Dusty Basin. It would be a shame for anyone to stand in its way." He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any real courtesy, and departed, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and financial ruin in his wake. Eden stood motionless until the sound of his horse faded. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She turned to Jessie, whose own breathing was shallow and quick. She knelt before him, taking the charcoal from his unresisting fingers. "Look at me, Jessie. We are not beaten. Not yet." Later that afternoon, Eden walked into town to deliver the finished shirts to the inn. The journey was a gauntlet of whispers. Dusty Basin was a small town, and a woman living alone. Raising her younger brother was a subject of endless speculation. She was 20, unmarried, and in the eyes of many, an oddity. She felt their stares, heard the murmurs that died as she approached. An orphan girl, all alone. Such a shame. Some of the talk was tinged with pity, but some of it was sharper, edged with a suspicion that she was somehow improper, a woman living outside the established order of things. She kept her chin high and her gaze fixed ahead, her face a calm mask that hid the turmoil within. As she passed the small chapel at the edge of town, the bell began to toll, a slow, hopeful sound that seemed to push back against the oppressive silence of the plains. For a few hours each week, she taught the town's handful of orphans their letters in the chapel's back room. The bell was a small symbol of that other life, a life of purpose beyond mere survival, a faint and fragile hope that she clung to. The town square was a chaotic mix of wagons, horses, and commerce. Farmers sold their produce, trappers displayed their furs, and children chased each other through the thick dust. Eden was heading toward the general store when the sound erupted. A string of firecrackers, set off by some mischievous boys, exploded with a series of sharp, violent cracks that sounded like gunfire. Jesse, who had insisted on accompanying her, cried out. It was not a shout of fear, but a raw, animal sound of pure terror. He dropped the basket he was carrying, his hands flying to his head as if to block out the noise. His body began to shake uncontrollably, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was no longer in the dusty market square. He was back in the darkness of the mine, the world collapsing around him. "Jesse, it's all right. It's just firecrackers." Eden grabbed his arms, trying to hold him, to ground him in the present. But he was lost to her, lost in the storm of his own memory. People were stopping to stare, to point, their curiosity a fresh torment. Suddenly, a man was there beside them. He was tall, with a quiet confidence that seemed to create a small pocket of calm in the surrounding chaos. He did not touch Jesse, but instead knelt down so he was at his level. "Son," the man said, his voice low and steady, "I need you to listen to my voice. Can you do that? Just listen to me?" This was Caleb Beaumont. Eden knew of him. Of course, everyone in the valley knew of the Beaumonts and their sprawling ranch. They knew how Caleb had taken over managing his half after his older brother's death, and how he had ridden into a blizzard last winter to rescue a family whose wagon had overturned. He had a reputation for being practical and unflappable. "I want you to breathe with me," Caleb said, his voice a calm rhythm. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Slow, just like you're calming a spooked horse." He demonstrated, and after a moment, Jesse's ragged gasps began to falterously match the pattern. Caleb's focus was entirely on Jesse, his presence a shield against the prying eyes of the crowd. He spoke about horses, about the steady gait of a good quarter horse, about the feel of solid leather reins in your hand. He talked about things that were solid, reliable, and safe. Slowly, the trembling in Jesse's limbs subsided. The wild terror in his eyes receded, replaced by a dazed exhaustion. He leaned heavily against Eden, his body spent. Eden looked at Caleb Beaumont, whose gaze was now on her. It was a clear, direct gaze, filled with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and unsettling. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. She pulled away slightly, reasserting the small perimeter around herself and her brother. She did not want his pity, or anyone else's. "He's got a good grip," Caleb observed, nodding toward Jesse. "He just needs a safe place to hold on." He stood up, towering over them for a moment. His clothes were the simple, durable garb of a working cowboy, but they were well kept. The reins of the horse he led were coiled neatly in one hand, a symbol of the control and discipline he seemed to embody. "We can manage," Eden said, her words clipped. She helped Jesse to his feet, gathering their spilled groceries with a hand that shook only slightly. Caleb simply nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He did not offer further help, seeming to sense that it would not be welcome. He tipped his hat, a gesture that, unlike Granger's, felt genuine. Then he turned and led his horse away, disappearing into the crowd as quietly as he had appeared. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Eden stood on her porch. Jesse was inside, asleep, finally at peace. The weight of the day, of Granger's threat and Jesse's collapse, settled heavily on her shoulders. She looked out at the land her father had loved, at the small stable that housed their one aging horse, at the simple cabin that was the only home she had ever known. The red dust swirled at her feet, a reminder of the hard, unyielding earth, but it was her earth, her home, and she would not let it be taken. She was a seamstress, a teacher, a sister. She would have to become a fighter, too. The wind picked up, carrying the lonely scent of sage, and Eden Quinn stood her ground, ready for the storm. A few nights later, an unnatural orange light flickered against the cabin's window, dancing where no light should be. Eden was mending one of Jesse's shirts by the last glow of the lamp when a sharp, crackling sound broke the evening quiet. Jesse, who had been sketching the familiar silhouette of the mountains, went rigid. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a familiar terror. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice thin and reedy. Before Eden could answer, the smell of smoke, acrid and oily, drifted through the chinks in the door. She was on her feet in an instant, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw the door open and recoiled from a blast of heat. A pile of dried corn husks stacked against the porch wall was ablaze, the flames licking hungrily at the wooden siding of their home. In the center of the fire, the shattered remains of a glass bottle glinted. This was no accident. Panic seized her for a heartbeat, cold and sharp. Then it was gone, replaced by a surge of furious resolve. "Jesse, get the water buckets." Now. Her brother was frozen, his gaze locked on the dancing flames, his breath coming in short, shallow pants. The fire was not large, but to him, it must have seemed a roaring inferno, another explosion bent on consuming his world. Just as Eden grabbed a heavy horse blanket from a hook, a rider thundered into their small yard, seemingly appearing out of the darkness. It was Caleb Beaumont. He vaulted from his saddle before his horse had even come to a full stop, pulling a large, wet canvas tarp from behind his saddle. "Get back!" he yelled, his voice a commanding crackle that cut through the noise of the fire. He moved with an economy of motion that was breathtaking, shaking the tarp out to its full size and, with a powerful heave, smothering the flames. The fire hissed and spat in protest, sending up a thick plume of greasy black smoke, but it was defeated. In less than a minute, all that remained was a smoking, blackened heap and a dark, ugly scorch mark that climbed the cabin wall like a scar. Caleb stood over the mess, his chest rising and falling, the canvas still in his hands. He kicked at the embers, ensuring they were dead. His face, illuminated by the moonlight, was grim. He looked at the shattered bottle, then at the hoof prints leading away from the cabin, already being softened by the breeze. He turned to find Eden standing on the porch, the useless horse blanket still clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. Jesse was huddled in the doorway behind her, shaking like a leaf in a high wind. Caleb's gaze softened as he looked at the boy, then hardened again as he met Eden's eyes. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She forced herself to look away from the scorch mark, this deliberate message of terror, and focused on her brother. She went to him, putting her arms around his trembling shoulders and guiding him back inside, away from the sight and the smell. When she returned to the porch, Caleb was still there, a silent, solid presence in the darkness. He had not moved. This was Granger's work. She said it was not a question. "It has his scent," Caleb agreed, his voice low. "A coward's warning." He finally dropped the heavy canvas to the ground. "He wants you scared. He wants you to run." "I am not running," she said, the words tasting of ash. "This is my home." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Eden wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill running through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "Why does he fear it so much?" Caleb asked. his voice unexpectedly gentle. "The noise. I saw it in the market. It is more than just being startled." Eden stared at the blackened patch on her home, the lie she had been living with, the heavy stone of guilt she had carried in her heart for 6 long months, suddenly felt too heavy to bear alone. She had protected this secret, guarded it as fiercely as she guarded her brother. But it was a poison, and it was killing them both slowly. Looking at this man, who had appeared out of the night to shield them from harm without asking for thanks or explanation, she felt a crack appear in the fortress she had built around herself. "He is afraid because of me," she said, the words barely a whisper. They seemed to tear something loose inside her as they came out. Caleb did not speak. He simply waited, his stillness an invitation. "The day the mine collapsed," she began, her voice gaining a little strength, though it trembled. "I was there. The new foreman, Mr. Evans, he was showing some investors around. He wanted to demonstrate the new detonators. He said they were safer." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "He needed someone to push the plunger for the test blast. A demonstration. The miners were all deep in the tunnels." He looked at me. "I was just there delivering some mended clothes. He told me to do it. He said it was perfectly safe, just a small charge to break up some rock at the entrance." She looked down at her hands, flexing the fingers that had once pushed that plunger. "I did not want to," but he insisted, puffing up his chest. "I was a girl. I was supposed to do as I was told, so I did it." There was a spark, a strange fizzing sound from the wires, and then the world fell in. The main support timbers gave way. It was not a small charge. Something was wrong with the wiring. They said later. A cascade. The sound, it was a roar that went on forever. Tears she had refused to shed for months burned at the back of her eyes. "I was thrown clear. I survived. Jesse was waiting for me at the mine entrance. He saw it all. He heard it all. And he knows I was the one who pushed the plunger. He does not blame me. He has never said a word, but I blame myself. Every time he flinches, every time a door slams, I am back there, with my hand on that device. He is afraid of the noise, but the noise is me." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. She finally looked at Caleb, expecting to see judgment or pity, or perhaps a polite withdrawal. Instead, she saw only a deep, quiet understanding. He had seen men break under far less. "You were a tool, Eden," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Evans was the hand that used you. The fault is his, not yours." "The guilt is mine," she countered, shaking her head. "It lives in this house with us. It sits at our table." Caleb looked past her, toward the dark doorway where Jesse was hiding. "Guilt is a saddle that gets heavier with every mile. But the boy, we can make a different kind of saddle for him." Eden frowned, not understanding. "A quiet saddle," he explained, his gaze becoming focused, practical. "Horses understand fear. They feel it. But they also understand rhythm. The steady clop of hooves on the trail, the gentle creak of leather, the feeling of a strong, calm hand on the reins. It is a language without explosions. We could bring him to my ranch, let him work with one of my calmest mares, just brushing her, leading her, feeling that steady, living rhythm. It might help. It might give him an anchor when the storm hits his mind." The idea was so unexpected, so direct and full of simple, earthy sense, that it took her breath away. It was not an offer of money or legal help. It was an offer of healing, a plan of action. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than dread. The next morning, however, brought a fresh assault. Silas Granger rode up again, this time with Sheriff Pike at his side. The sheriff, a man whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as the money that bought it, stayed in his saddle, a silent, imposing presence. Granger dismounted, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Good morning, Miss Quinn. I trust you slept well. No disturbances. His eyes flicked to the scorch mark on the wall, a clear acknowledgement of his handiwork. "What do you want?" Granger Eden asked, her arms crossed. "I have come with an offer. A generous one," he said, pulling a document from his coat. It was a map, a survey of the valley. A thick red line was drawn straight through the heart of it, straight through her property. As I mentioned, progress is coming. The Trans-Wyoming Rail Line. This is the official, approved route. He tapped the map. Your little plot of land is directly in its path. Now, I am authorized to offer you a settlement, enough to clear your father's debt and give you a small amount to start over somewhere else, far away from here. He named a sum that was an insult, barely enough to cover the lumber in her cabin. It was legalized theft. The railroad will bring prosperity to everyone. "Eden," Sheriff Pike said from his horse, his voice a low rumble. "It is for the good of the community. You would not want to stand in the way of that? Would you?" The news spread through Dusty Basin like a prairie fire. The town was instantly divided. For some, the word railroad was a magical incantation, promising wealth, new business, and a connection to the wider world. They saw Granger as a visionary. For others, farmers and ranchers whose families had worked the land for a generation, it was a threat, a steel serpent that would cut their properties in two and put them at the mercy of powerful men like Granger. Eden's small homestead became the first battleground. She met Caleb at the general store later that day. The tension in the town was palpable. Neighbors who had shared coffee for years now eyed each other with suspicion. Caleb looked at the worried lines on her face. "You sew such a straight seam," he said, his voice a low murmur that only she could hear. "How did life let your thread get so tangled?" Eden managed a small, tired smile. "I do not get to choose the needle and thread for my own fate. Mr. Beaumont." "Caleb," he corrected her gently, "and maybe you do not choose it, but you can choose how you hold it." Even the church, her place of quiet solace, offered no comfort. Father Michael, a gentleman who prized peace above all else, took her aside after she had finished teaching the orphans their letters. "Eden, my child," he began, his hands clasped nervously. "I have heard about Mr. Granger's offer. Perhaps it would be wise to accept it. It is a small price to pay for peace in the valley, to avoid further trouble." Eden looked at the kind, worried man and felt a profound sadness. Can a person put a price on memories? "Father, he is asking me to sell my father's sweat and my mother's garden. He wants to buy the place where Jesse learned to walk. Some things do not have a price." She walked home as the sun began to set, the 30-day deadline a constant, drumming pressure in her mind. 28 days now. The path ahead was clouded with uncertainty and danger. But as she approached her cabin, she saw the dark, ugly scorch mark on the wall. It was a reminder of the threat, a symbol of Granger's malice. But it was also something else. It was a mark of survival. The fire had been set, but they had put it out. The wall was scarred, but the house still stood, true to his word. Caleb arrived 2 days later, not on his usual working horse, but leading a beautiful white mare whose gentle eyes seemed to absorb the harsh morning light and soften it. She moved with a liquid grace, her hooves making a soft, shushing sound in the red dust. Jesse watched from the window, his apprehension a visible thing, a tension in his shoulders and a tightness around his mouth. "Her name is Solace," Caleb said, his voice quiet as he stopped in the yard. He did not address Jesse directly, but spoke to the air between them, letting the boy overhear. "She is afraid of loud noises, too, but she knows my voice. She knows the feel of a calm hand." Eden stood on the porch, a silent observer. Letting this man into their fragile world felt like a profound risk, a surrender of the fierce control she had maintained for so long. But the memory of the fire, and the deeper memory of her own role in Jesse's trauma, pushed her forward. This was not about her pride. It was about his peace. She walked with them to the small, quiet paddock behind the Beaumont Ranch house, a place sheltered from the wind by a stand of old cottonwoods. The journey itself was quiet. Caleb leading the mare, and Eden walking beside Jessie, her presence a steady, reassuring anchor. Inside the paddock, Caleb did not suggest riding. He simply handed Jessie a soft brush. "A horse likes to be talked to," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But they listen more to your hands than your words. They listen to your breathing. Start at her neck. Long, slow strokes. Match them to your breath." Jessie hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the brush. He looked at Eden, his eyes asking a question she could not answer. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. He took the brush and approached the mare. Solace turned her head, her nostrils flaring as she took in his scent, but she stood perfectly still. Hesitantly, Jessie touched the brush to her gleaming white coat. He began to move it, a short, jerky motion. "Slower," Caleb coached gently. "Like this." He placed his hand over Jessie's, guiding him in a long, smooth stroke that followed the line of the horse's muscle. "Feel that is the rhythm. Now you try." Eden stood by the fence, her hand resting on the top rail. Caleb gestured for her to take the lead rope. "Just hold it," he said. "Let her know you are here too." For years, Eden had held every rope, managed every detail, borne every burden alone, to now stand by, a helper, and to let this man guide the most important work of her life, was an act of profound trust. She took the soft leather rope, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. She was no longer the sole protector. She was part of a partnership. They stayed for over an hour. Jessie did not speak, but his breathing evened out, and the rigid tension in his shoulders began to dissolve. He moved from the horse's neck to her back, his strokes becoming more confident, more rhythmic. He was not just grooming a horse, he was engaging in a silent conversation, a communion of shared vulnerabilities. As they worked, Caleb taught him to listen to the horse's soft snorts, to watch the twitch of her ears, to feel the steady, powerful beat of her heart through her warm skin. It was a language of quiet, a world away from the shattering roar of the mine. On the ride home, Jessie was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the brittle, fearful silence she was used to, but a thoughtful, calmer stillness. That evening, she found him at the table, not sketching the mountains, but drawing solace from memory. Later, she saw another page filled with swirling, chaotic lines, a dark knot of energy. Beneath it, he had drawn a series of straight, parallel lines, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat or the fall of a horse's hooves. He was finding a new vocabulary for his fear, a way to map it without having to speak its name. The next day, Caleb found Eden behind her cabin, staring at the parched vegetable garden. The early autumn had been unforgivingly dry, and the earth was cracked and thirsty. "There is a way," he said, coming to stand beside her. He pointed toward a line of willows about 100 yards behind her small stable. "Willows do not grow like that without a reason. Their roots are drinking from something. I would wager my best saddle there is a groundwater spring running right under your property." Eden looked at the line of green, a stark contrast to the surrounding brown. She had seen it 1,000 times, but had never understood its significance. "If we dig a well," Caleb continued, his eyes alight with practical energy, "we could have water, enough for the garden, enough for the stock, enough to irrigate that back pasture. With water, you could grow a late crop of hay. Good hay fetches a high price, especially with winter coming. It would be enough to pay Granger." Hope, sharp and painful and beautiful, pierced through the dull armor of her resignation. It was a tangible plan, a weapon forged from earth and water and knowledge. It was a way to fight back, not just to endure. But their newfound hope was short-lived. The following afternoon, while walking the property line to mark the best spot for the well, they found it. The carved wooden stake that marked the southern corner of the Quinn property had been uprooted. In its place, a new, raw pine stake had been driven into the ground, a full 20 yards inside her land, effectively stealing her best pasture and the very ground where the willows grew. A cold, hard anger settled in Eden's stomach. This was how Granger fought, not with open threats, but with sly, dishonest maneuvers under the cover of law. He would not dare, she breathed, staring at the stake. He would, and he did, Caleb said, his jaw tight. He thinks no one will challenge him. He thinks you are a girl alone who will be too scared to fight back. They spent the rest of the afternoon searching, and found the other 2 corner markers had been similarly moved. It was a systematic theft of her land, her resources, and her future. The next morning, they returned to the southern corner, Caleb carrying the original, weathered stake and a heavy post driver. As they worked to pull the new stake from the ground, the sound of an approaching wagon made them look up. It was Nora, the innkeeper, driving her supply wagon back from a neighboring ranch, her young helper, a boy named Robbie, sitting beside her. Nora pulled her team to a halt. She was a large, sensible woman with a no-nonsense gaze that missed nothing. "Trouble?" she asked, her eyes taking in the 2 stakes and the grim expressions on their faces. "Just correcting a survey error, Nora," Caleb said evenly. Nora snorted. "I call it by its proper name, thievery." She looked at the raw pine stake with contempt. "I saw 2 of Granger's men out here late last night. Did not think much of it then. Now I see. They were busy as rats in a pantry." She turned to the boy beside her. "Robbie, you saw them too, did you not?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am. They had a lantern. I saw them pulling up the old post." "Well then," Nora said, her voice full of satisfaction, "it seems you have witnesses. Eden, should the sheriff have any questions about trespassing, you tell him to come talk to me. I keep an honest inn. And I expect an honest town." She clucked to her horses and drove on, leaving a cloud of dust and the welcome gift of her alliance. That evening, a sense of fragile victory settled over the small cabin. Eden had made a pot of bean stew, thick with chili peppers from her wilting garden. She invited Caleb to stay and share it with them, an unspoken acknowledgement of their new partnership. The 3 of them sat around the small table, the warmth from the cast-iron stove pushing back the evening chill. The stew was powerful, and Caleb, unaccustomed to Eden's liberal use of spice, took a large spoonful. His eyes widened, and a strangled cough escaped him. He reached hastily for his water cup, his face turning a shade of red that had nothing to do with the setting sun. A sound bubbled up from across the table. At first it was just a sputter, a choked giggle. Then it came, a full, clear, wonderful sound that Eden had not heard in 6 long months. Jesse was laughing. He was laughing so hard that tears were streaming down his face, his whole body shaking with a mirth that was pure and unburdened. Eden stared at her brother, her own eyes filling with tears of a different kind. The sight of Caleb, the stoic, capable cowboy, undone by a bowl of beans, had somehow broken through the wall of Jesse's fear and let the joy out. She looked at Caleb, who was watching Jesse with a soft, lopsided smile, all pretense of composure forgotten. In that moment, he was not a rich cowboy or a savior. He was just a man with a burning mouth who had made her brother laugh. She saw in him not a promise of rescue, but a shoulder that did not offer empty words. A quiet strength that simply showed up and helped reset the crooked markers of the world. The whispers in town grew louder in the following days. The story of Caleb Beaumont spending his evenings at the Quinn cabin was too delicious a piece of gossip to ignore. The little seamstress has caught herself a Beaumont. They murmured over their sewing circles and at the general store, using that poor brother of hers as bait. Eden heard the words. She felt the sting of their judgment, the injustice of their assumptions. But she did not answer them. She had work to do. She had a well to dig, a brother to heal, and a home to save. She met their sideways glances with a quiet, steady gaze, her silence a more powerful retort than any angry words. Her hands were busy with her needle and with the lead rope of a gentle white horse. She had no time for the tangled threads of town gossip. From the distant hills, another sound began to carry on the wind, a faint but persistent rhythm that underscored their days. It was the clang of hammers on steel, the sound of the railroad pushing its way west. It was the sound of Granger's progress. It was the sound of a clock ticking down the days. 24 left. The days that followed were a blur of strenuous, hopeful labor. Caleb, Eden, and a surprisingly determined Jesse worked from sunup to sundown, digging the well. The work was slow and punishing, a battle against stubborn rock and dry earth. But with every foot they dug, the hope grew. They were not just digging for water. They were digging for their independence, for a future free from the shadow of Silas Granger. But the parched land held another threat. The sky for a week had been a brazen, metallic blue, and the air was thick and still, trapping the heat. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. One afternoon, the horizon began to flicker with silent, angry flashes of light, dry lightning, without the promise of rain, a rancher's worst fear. By late afternoon, a new scent tainted the familiar smell of sage and dust. It was the smell of smoke, distant but unmistakable. An angry orange glow began to stain the northern sky, and a dark pillar of smoke climbed toward the heavens, a grim signal of disaster. The fire was moving fast, driven by a hot, fickle wind that had suddenly sprung to life, and it was moving toward them. The chapel bell began to ring, not with its usual steady toll, but in a frantic, urgent peal of alarm. It was a call to arms that every soul in the valley understood. Caleb was already in motion, his face set in a grim mask of determination. "Get every bucket, every barrel you have," he commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Fill them from the trough. Wet down the cabin roof and the stable. I will get the wagon." He raced toward his horse as men from neighboring homesteads began to appear, their faces smudged with soot and anxiety. They carried shovels and axes and wore a shared expression of grim resolve. This was a battle against a common enemy, an enemy that did not care about property lines or personal disputes. Eden worked with a frantic, focused energy, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. She hauled bucket after bucket of precious water, dousing the dry timbers of her home until they were dark and dripping. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. The roar of the approaching fire was a terrifying, living sound, a hungry beast consuming everything in its path. Caleb returned with his heavy work wagon, a large water barrel sloshing in the back. He drove it as close to the advancing fire line as he dared, the horses stamping and snorting, their eyes wide with terror. He and the other men began digging a fire break, a wide scar in the earth meant to starve the flames of fuel. Eden saw a water trough near the stable, too heavy for one person to move. An idea, born of desperation, flashed in her mind. She ran to the paddock, her heart pounding. "Solace," she called, her voice tight with urgency. The white mare came to her, her ears twitching nervously at the chaos. With trembling hands, Eden slipped a harness over the horse's head and hitched her to the heavy trough. "Easy, girl, easy," she murmured, her voice a low, calming whisper against the roar of the fire. "We have to be brave now." She guided Solace, the mare responding to the calm in her voice despite the surrounding terror. They dragged the sloshing trough of water toward the fire line, a desperate, mobile well to aid the fighters. Caleb saw what she was doing, and a look of fierce pride flashed in his eyes. He worked the pump on his water barrel, spraying a pitifully small stream of water onto the advancing wall of orange and black. Amidst the chaos, Jesse stood frozen near the cabin, his face ashen, his body rigid. The roar, the heat, the suffocating smoke, it was the mine all over again, a waking nightmare. The old terror was reaching for him, threatening to pull him down into its dark, silent abyss. He saw the flames leap from a stand of sagebrush to the edge of the pasture where they had planned to grow their hay, the hay that was meant to save them. Eden saw him falter. "Jesse," she screamed over the din. "Jesse, look at me." Her voice seemed to reach him across the chasm of his fear. He turned his head, his eyes finding hers. He saw her, not panicked, not broken, but fighting, her face grimed with soot, her hands firmly on the reins of the beautiful white horse. And then he saw Caleb's water barrel. He ran to it, his movement stiff and uncoordinated. He saw a loose metal lid from a storage crate lying on the ground. He picked it up. As Caleb pumped water, Jesse began to beat a steady, frantic rhythm on the side of the barrel with the lid. Clang, clang, clang. It was a noise of his own making, a loud, defiant, rhythmic sound that he controlled. He was not a victim of the roar. He was adding his own voice to it. He focused on the beat, letting it fill his head, pushing out the terrifying, chaotic noise of the fire. He was creating his own anchor, his own steady rhythm in the heart of the storm. He was keeping time for the firefighters, a desperate, defiant drumbeat against the apocalypse. For what felt like an eternity, they fought, the whole community, a small, determined army, battled the inferno. They were losing. The firebreak was breached in a dozen places. The heat was unbearable, the smoke a choking blanket. Just as Eden felt the last of her strength begin to fail, a new sound reached her ears, a sound almost as shocking as the fire itself. A low rumble of thunder, real thunder this time. A fat drop of water hit her cheek, and then another. The sky, which had been a clear, cruel blue just hours before, was now a bruised, angry gray. The heavens opened. It was not a gentle shower, but a sudden, violent downpour, a deluge that fell in hissing sheets. The rain hammered down on the fire, on the parched earth, on the exhausted, soot-stained people. The roar of the flames was replaced by a great, collective hiss of defeat. Steam rose from the blackened ground in dense white clouds. They stood, stunned and silent, in the sudden, blessed coolness of the rain, too exhausted to cheer. They had not won, they had been saved. The aftermath was a scene of grim desolation. A vast black wound stretched across the valley, smoking and steaming in the downpour. The fire had been stopped just yards from Eden's back pasture, but it had not been stopped in time to save the small barn where she stored her grain and the hay she had managed to harvest earlier in the year. A significant portion of her assets, the small cushion she had against absolute poverty, was now a heap of smoldering, blackened ruin. The plan to sell the hay, the very foundation of their fight against Granger, was gone. The next morning, as a misty rain continued to fall, Silas Granger rode out to survey the damage. He was, as always, impeccably dressed, his polished boots navigating the muddy, ash-strewn ground with distaste. He found Eden and Caleb standing by the ruined barn, the sickening smell of burnt hay thick in the air. "A terrible tragedy," Granger said, his voice oozing a false sympathy that was more insulting than open contempt. "A terrible tragedy indeed. You have my deepest condolences, Miss Quinn." He gestured vaguely at the blackened mess. "This must be a terrible burden for you. I would be willing, as a gesture of goodwill to the community, to take this damaged property off your hands. I will, of course, have to adjust my previous offer to account for the loss, but I will still give you enough to clear your father's debt. I will even have my men clean up this unpleasantness for you." Eden stared at him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her face was still smudged with soot. Her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep, but her eyes held a fire that no rain could extinguish. "This is still my land, Mr. Granger," she said, her voice hoarse with smoke and resolve. "Burnt or not, it is not for sale." Granger's mask of sympathy dropped, replaced by a cold sneer. "Suit yourself," he said. He turned his horse and rode away, a clean, dark figure against the gray. ruined landscape. That night, the stress of the fire and the renewed desperation of their situation took its toll. Eden was awakened by a small, whimpering sound from the other side of the cabin. She rose and went to Jesse's bedside. He was thrashing in his sleep, caught in the grip of a nightmare, his face slick with sweat. She sat on the edge of his bed and put a hand on his shoulder. "Jesse, Jesse, wake up. It is all right. You are safe." His eyes flew open, wide and unseeing with remembered terror. He was back in the darkness, back in the fire, back in the mine. His whole body began to tremble. Eden gathered him into her arms, holding him tightly as she had done when he was a small boy. "Shh," she whispered, her cheek against his hair. "Listen to me. Listen to my voice. It is over. We are safe." She held him, rocking him gently until the trembling began to subside. "I was the one who made the noise that hurt you," she said, her voice a raw, painful whisper in the darkness. "I know that. I will carry that forever. But yesterday, Jesse, I was the one who helped put out the fire. I will be the one who puts out the fires from now on." She had not realized Caleb was standing in the open doorway, a silent witness in the shadows. He had come to check on them, and had stopped when he heard Jesse's cries. He watched as Eden comforted her brother, her fierce, protective love a tangible presence in the small, dark room. When she finally rose, having soothed Jesse back to a peaceful sleep, she found Caleb on the porch, staring out into the rain-swept darkness. "You are too hard on yourself," he said quietly, without turning to look at her. He had heard her confession. "Am I?" she asked, her voice weary. He turned then, and in the faint light from the cabin, she saw an expression of profound tenderness on his face. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple, grounding gesture. "Do not burn yourself alive in an old mistake, Eden." They stood like that for a long moment, the rain drumming softly on the roof, the world washed clean and quiet around them. And as they stood there, a small, strange thing happened. Jesse, who they had thought was fast asleep, appeared in the doorway. He looked at Caleb's dark, soaked hat, which was dripping water onto the porch floor. "Your hat looks like a burnt biscuit," he said, his voice sleepy but clear. A moment of stunned silence. And then a small laugh escaped Eden. Caleb looked down at his hat, and a slow, wide grin spread across his face. Soon, all three of them were laughing, a quiet, gentle sound in the rainy night. It was the sound of survivors, the sound of hope refusing to be extinguished. The fire had taken much, but it had left something behind, too. The ash on the fields, now turning to dark, rich mud under the healing rain was not an ending, but a new kind of beginning. The rain that saved them from the fire also turned the valley into a sea of mud, slowing everything to a thick, ponderous crawl. The work of digging the well resumed, but now the earth was heavy and sodden, clinging to their shovels and boots with a greedy persistence. Yet, the mood in the small Quinn cabin had shifted. The fire had been a trial by ordeal, and they had, in their own way, survived it. There was a new, quiet strength in Jesse, a resilience Eden had not seen since before the mine collapse. Caleb's suspicion, however, had taken root and was growing. The image of the map Granger had so arrogantly displayed was seared into his memory. There was something about the official-looking seal on the corner, an ornate stamp of red wax, that had bothered him. It had seemed too perfect, too clean, for a document that had supposedly traveled all the way from the territorial capital. It was a small thing, a detail that most would overlook. But Caleb had learned from a life of reading the land that small details often told the biggest stories. "A railroad survey is a public document," he said to Eden one evening as they cleaned their tools. "It has to be filed at the land office in Cheyenne. Anyone can request to see it." He paused, his gaze distant. "My brother, he used a lawyer there sometimes. a man named Thompson. A good, honest man. I think it is time I paid him a visit." Before he left, he sought out their new allies. He found Nora in the kitchen of her inn, kneading a mountain of dough with practiced, powerful hands. He recounted his suspicions about the survey map and the displaced boundary markers. Nora listened intently, her flour-dusted hands never ceasing their rhythmic work. "Granger and the sheriff," she said, her voice a low rumble of contempt. "They have been thick as thieves for months, always meeting in that back corner booth, thinking no one is paying them any mind." She wiped her hands on her apron and went to a small desk in the corner, retrieving a thick, leather-bound ledger. "I keep a record of who comes and goes, who eats on credit. It is just good business." She flipped through the pages, her finger running down a list of names and dates. "Here we are," she said, tapping the page. "Granger and Pike. Met 3 times in the week before your stakes were moved. The last time was the night before it happened. They stayed late, drank Granger's expensive whiskey." She closed the book with a decisive snap. "It is not proof of a crime, but it is a map of the road they took to get there. You tell your lawyer that, and you tell him young Robbie is ready to tell anyone who will listen what he saw that night, armed with Nora's timeline and the promise of a witness." Caleb set out for Cheyenne, leaving Eden and Jesse to continue their work. The whispers and stares in town seemed to intensify in his absence. Eden felt them like a physical touch, a constant, nagging pressure. One afternoon, as she was buying thread at the general store, 2 of the town's most notorious gossips cornered her near the pickle barrel. "Well now, Eden," one of them began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "it seems you are keeping Mr. Beaumont very busy these days. A person might think you have roped and tied him for good." Eden met the woman's cruel, curious gaze without flinching. She held up her hands, showing her palms, which were calloused and stained with dirt from digging the well. "I have 2 hands to work with," she said, her voice clear and calm, easily heard by everyone else in the store. "I have none to spare for tying anyone down." The women flushed and fell silent, and a low murmur of appreciation went through the store. Eden had not raised her voice, but she had won the skirmish. Her true victory, however, came a few days later. The sun had finally returned, and the earth was beginning to dry. She and Jesse were with Solace in the paddock. Over the past weeks, Jesse had grown remarkably comfortable with the mare, leading her, grooming her, and even sitting on her back while Eden held the reins. But he had never taken the reins himself. Today, something was different. After brushing Solace until her coat shone like new snow, Jesse looked at Eden. "I want to try," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Eden's heart gave a painful lurch. She handed him the leather reins, her hands trembling slightly. He gathered them with a careful, practiced motion, just as Caleb had shown him. He clicked his tongue softly. "Walk on. Solace," he said. The mare took a step, then another. Jesse sat tall in the saddle, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the horse, his focus absolute. He guided her in a slow, careful circle around the paddock. Once, then twice. He was not just riding. He was in command, a gentle, confident partner to the powerful animal beneath him. Eden stood by the fence, tears streaming down her face, silent and unchecked. It was not the spectacle of a boy on a horse. It was the sight of her brother, who had been lost in a silent, terrifying world. Finally taking the reins of his own life again. It was a miracle forged from patience and the quiet language of a gentle horse. The fragile peace was shattered the day Silas Granger returned, this time with Sheriff Pike and 2 grim-faced deputies. They rode directly up to the well, where Eden and Jesse were working. "This is your final warning. Miss Quinn," Granger said, his voice hard and cold. He pointed at the half-dug well. "This land is slated for the Trans-Wyoming Railroad. This hole is an obstruction of progress, a federal offense. If you do not cease this foolishness and vacate the property, I will have Sheriff Pike arrest you for impeding the construction of a national enterprise." Sheriff Pike shifted his weight in the saddle, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "He is right. Miss, the law's the law. I would hate to have to lock you up." Jesse shrank back, the old fear returning to his eyes at the sight of the armed men. Eden stepped in front of him, placing herself between her brother and the threat. "You will not touch him," she said, her voice low and fierce, "and you will not set foot on this property again without a lawful warrant." Just then, 2 riders appeared on the road. It was Caleb, and beside him was a slender, older gentleman in a city suit, who looked profoundly out of place in the dusty Wyoming landscape. Caleb rode up and dismounted, his eyes cold as steel as he looked at Granger. "You are trespassing." "Silas." "I am conducting official business," Granger retorted. "This is Mr. Thompson," Caleb said, ignoring him and gesturing to the man in the suit. "He is an attorney, and he has some interesting news from the Territorial Land Office." Mr. Thompson dismounted, carefully brushing the dust from his trousers. He produced a set of papers from his briefcase. "I have reviewed the official railroad survey filed in Cheyenne," he said, his voice dry and precise. "It is a fascinating document. The route it specifies does indeed pass through this valley. However, it passes a full 2 miles north of this property. This land," he said, tapping one of the documents, "is not, and has never been, in the path of the railroad." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Granger's face went pale. "Furthermore," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "I find this other document you have been showing people even more fascinating." He held up a paper that looked identical to the one Granger had shown Eden, especially this handsome red wax seal. "I took the liberty of showing it to the clerk at the land office. He was quite impressed. He had never seen one quite like it. The official seal, you see, is a simple embossed stamp, not wax, and certainly not this ornate design. The red wax seal, the symbol of Granger's false power, was now exposed as a cheap forgery." Granger sputtered, his composure finally cracking. This is a misunderstanding, a clerical error. I believe the legal term is fraud," Mr. Thompson said calmly. Sheriff Pike, seeing the tide turn so suddenly, began to back his horse away. Caleb stepped in front of him, blocking his path, leaving so soon. "Sheriff, I thought you were here to uphold the law." Pike's face was a mottled red. "Now listen here, Beaumont," he growled, his hand inching toward his gun. "You would be wise not to make an enemy of the biggest creditor in this county. Granger holds the note on half the ranches in this valley." Caleb did not even glance at the sheriff's hand. He looked the man straight in the eye, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. "I have no quarrel with an honest creditor. Pike," he said, his voice deceptively soft, "I am only against a wallet that has grown fat on dirty money." The confrontation hung in the air, taut and humming with unspoken violence. The deputies looked uncertainly from Pike to Granger to the calm, implacable figures of Caleb and his lawyer. The intricate web of lies and intimidation that Granger had woven around Dusty Basin was beginning to unravel, thread by single, rotten thread. The public humiliation of Silas Granger did not bring the peace Eden had hoped for. It was a victory in the eyes of the law, a vindication on paper, but it did not touch the deeper, more tangled wound that still festered in her own heart. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, had returned to Cheyenne, leaving behind a fragile sense of legal security. But the shadow of the mine explosion remained, a silent third resident in their small cabin. One quiet evening, a few days after the confrontation, Eden sat across from Jesse at the small table. He was sketching, his charcoal moving with a newfound confidence across the page. He was drawing solace, but he had placed the mare in a field of new grass, under a calm, clear sky. It was a picture of peace, a future he was beginning to believe in. looking at it. Eden knew she could no longer keep her own past locked away. The final piece of the truth, the part she had confessed to Caleb but never to her brother, had to be spoken aloud. The secret was a wall between them, and she needed to tear it down, no matter the cost. She took a deep breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Jesse," she began, her voice unsteady, "there is more I have to tell you. About that day, at the mine." Jesse's hand stilled. He did not look up from his drawing, but his entire body went rigid, bracing for a blow. "I told you that the foreman, Mr. Evans, made me push the plunger," she said, her words coming out in a painful, halting rush. "That part is true. He insisted, but that is not all of it." She closed her eyes, the images replaying in her mind with perfect, terrible clarity. "Before he told me to do it, when he was showing the detonator to the investors, he asked me to help him. He said he needed to test the wire connection. He handed me the end of a wire and the trigger cap. He told me to just touch them together for a second when he gave the signal, just a little spark. He said to make sure the line was live." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I did it. I did not understand what it was. It was just a small, simple action. There was a little pop, a tiny spark, and then he wired it to the main plunger. He was careless. He was showing off. The wire must have been faulty. Or maybe the connection I tested somehow compromised the whole system. The inquiry said it was a faulty wire, but I was the one who held it. My hand was the first part of the chain reaction that brought the mountain down." She finally opened her eyes and looked at her brother. His face was ashen, his knuckles white where he gripped the charcoal. He was staring at her now, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. "I did not just push the plunger." "Jesse," she whispered, the confession tearing through her like a physical wound. "I helped to arm the weapon. That is why I blame myself. That is the truth." The silence that followed was immense, a crushing weight that seemed to suck all the air from the room. Jesse began to tremble, a fine, violent shaking that started in his hands and spread through his entire body. A low, wounded sound escaped his lips. He looked from her face to his own shaking hands, as if seeing for the first time the true source of their shared trauma. Then, to her astonishment, he pushed his chair back and stumbled toward her. He did not recoil in horror or anger. He fell to his knees before her chair and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her lap. His body was racked with sobs, great, shuddering gasps of grief and release. "I was so scared," he cried, his voice muffled by her dress. "I was so scared, but I was not scared of you, Eden. Never you." He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears and charcoal. "I am afraid of the noise, not my sister." A wave of emotion so powerful it almost broke her washed over Eden. She leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders, and held him. All the guilt, all the secrets, all the terrible, lonely weight she had carried for so long, finally dissolved in a flood of shared tears. They wept together, for the men lost in the mine, for the fear that had stolen Jesse's boyhood, and for the terrible silence that had almost destroyed them. It was not an absolution, but it was a beginning. It was the first true step on the long road to healing. The next afternoon, with a newfound lightness in his heart, Jesse rode Solace out to check the fence line at the edge of their property. It was a chore he had offered to do, a small step toward reclaiming his place in the world. He was gone longer than expected. When the sun began to dip below the mountains and he had not returned, a cold tendril of unease began to creep up Eden's spine. She walked out to the road, scanning the empty horizon. Nothing. She called his name until her throat was raw. Only the wind answered. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. She was about to run for help when she saw it, lying in the dust near the gate. His sketchbook. It was open to a half-finished drawing of a hawk circling in the sky. It was not a place he would have simply dropped it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that this was Granger's doing. He had been humiliated, exposed as a fraud, but he had not been defeated. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Granger had been backed into a corner. He could not win with law, so he had resorted to lawlessness. Just as the full, terrifying weight of this realization crashed down on her, Caleb rode into the yard. He took one look at her face, at the sketchbook clutched in her hand, and he knew. Where was all he said? His voice a low, dangerous growl. "I do not know," she cried, her voice breaking. "He is just gone." As if on cue, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure who rode not with haste, but with the arrogant leisure of a messenger who knows he holds all the cards. It was one of Granger's men. He stopped a respectful distance away and held up a piece of paper. "Mr. Granger wishes to see the lady of the house," the man called out. "He has a business proposition. He is waiting at the old Miller place. He suggests she come alone and bring the deed to her property, signed over to him. He says her brother is waiting for her." He dropped the paper in the dust and galloped away. A new kind of storm was brewing. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was turning a sickly yellow-brown. The wind began to pick up, not the gentle evening breeze, but a fierce, hot gale that whipped dust and grit into the air, stinging their skin and obscuring the setting sun. A sandstorm. "Stay here," Caleb said, his face a granite mask of fury. "I will handle this." "No," Eden said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He took my brother. He wants me. We do this together." They rode into the teeth of the storm, the world dissolving around them into a howling, blinding chaos of sand and wind. Visibility was reduced to a few yards. The landscape, so familiar by day, became a treacherous, alien world. The old Miller place was an abandoned homestead a few miles away, a collection of dilapidated buildings that were slowly being reclaimed by the prairie. Finding it in this maelstrom would be a miracle. They rode hunched in their saddles, their bandanas pulled up over their faces, the wind tearing at them, trying to rip them from their horses. The sound was a deafening roar, a constant, grinding assault on the senses. "We will never find them in this," Eden shouted, her words snatched away by the wind. Caleb pulled his horse up close to hers. "He is smart," he yelled back. "He will be tapping. He knows we will listen." The realization struck Eden with the force of a physical blow. Jesse, his rhythm, the anchor he had learned to create in the chaos of his own mind. He would use it now. He would be talking to them in the only way he could. They stopped their horses and listened, straining to hear anything beyond the roar of the wind. For a long, heart-stopping minute, there was nothing. Then, faint and tinny. So quiet she almost thought she had imagined it. She heard it, a rhythmic tapping, irregular but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. It was a beacon, a tiny signal of hope in the overwhelming chaos. They turned their horses toward the sound, their own hope a fragile flame against the fury of the storm. The sound led them to a dilapidated barn, its doors hanging crookedly on broken hinges. The tapping was coming from inside. Caleb dismounted, pulling his pistol from its holster. He gestured for Eden to stay back, but she slid from her saddle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Caleb moved to the side of the door, pressing himself flat against the weathered wood. He could hear the low murmur of voices inside. 2 men. He kicked the door open with a violent crash and was inside before the 2 thugs, who were playing cards on an overturned barrel, could even react. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Caleb moved with a lethal efficiency, and within moments, both men were unconscious on the dirt floor. In the back of the barn, tied to a support post, was Jesse. He was pale and trembling, but his eyes were alight with a fierce, desperate hope. He had been tapping on an old tin water trough with a rock. Eden rushed to his side, pulling a small knife from her boot and sawing at the thick ropes that bound him. "It is all right, Jesse," she whispered, her voice a soothing murmur against the howl of the wind outside. "We are here. You are safe." The moment the ropes fell away, a violent tremor racked his body. The delayed reaction, the terror he had held at bay, came crashing down on him. His breathing became shallow and ragged, the prelude to a full-blown panic attack. Eden dropped the knife and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Breathe with me. Jesse," she commanded, her voice firm and calm. "Look at me, in and out, just like with Solace. Feel my hands. You are not in the mine. You are in a barn, and we are going home." She counted the breaths, her voice a steady, rhythmic anchor, until the terror in his eyes began to recede and his breathing evened out. They returned to town under the cover of the dying storm, the three of them a grim, silent procession. They did not go home. They went straight to the sheriff's office. They found Sheriff Pike sitting at his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a penknife. One of his deputies, a young, earnest-looking man named Tom Avery, stood by the window, looking out at the storm. Caleb shoved the two dazed and bruised thugs into the office. "I am filing charges," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Kidnapping, assault, on behalf of Jesse Quinn." Pike looked from the thugs to Caleb, his face a mask of bored indifference. He did not even bother to stand up. "You got any proof of this fantastic story, Beaumont?" "I have two witnesses," Caleb said, gesturing to Eden and Jesse. "And these two men, who I am sure will be happy to tell you who hired them." Pike sighed, a long, theatrical sound of weary impatience. He got up and took a statement, writing it down with agonizing slowness. "All right," he said when he was finished. "I will look into it. You can go home now." But the next day, when Caleb returned to check on the charges, Pike just shrugged. "Lost the report," he said with a smirk. "Terrible storm last night. Wind must have blown it right off my desk. Without that statement, I have got nothing. My hands are tied." From the corner of the room, Deputy Tom Avery watched, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He had been there the night the boundary stakes were moved. He had seen Granger's men. He had heard the whispers. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that Sheriff Pike was lying. He said nothing, but his silence was a heavy, uncomfortable thing. That evening, back at the cabin, the reality of their situation settled in. The law in Dusty Basin was a broken tool, wielded by a corrupt man. They were on their own. Eden was cleaning the grit from a rifle when she finally turned to Caleb. "That was a reckless thing to do," she said, her voice tight with a fear she had not allowed herself to feel during the crisis. "Riding in there like that. You could have been killed." Caleb, who was drinking a cup of coffee so strong it was almost black, looked at her over the rim of the mug. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. "I have two main interests in this life. Eden," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "strong coffee, and doing the right thing." And I was all out of coffee. The physical storm passed with the dawn, leaving the world scoured and raw. A thin layer of sand covered everything, a gritty blanket over the wounded land. The air was unnaturally still, the silence profound and heavy. Inside the cabin, the emotional storm still raged. Jesse had not spoken since their return. He sat at the table, his hands lying limp in his lap, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that only he could see. He was there, but he was also 1,000 miles away, trapped in the memory of ropes and darkness and the roar of the wind. Eden moved around him in a bubble of forced calm, making coffee, stoking the small stove. Every normal action felt like a lie against the backdrop of his silent terror. She knew this stillness. It was the deep, quiet water that came before the waterfall. The trigger, when it came, was a small thing, a gust of wind, A leftover from the storm rattled the window pane in its frame. A sharp, sudden clatter. It was enough. A violent tremor shot through Jesse's body. His head snapped around, his eyes wild and unseeing. A low, keening sound, the noise of a cornered animal, escaped his throat. He scrambled back from the table, his chair tipping over with a crash that only amplified his terror. "No," he whispered, his hands flying up to cover his ears. No more noise. Eden was at his side in an instant, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She did not try to reason with him. The part of him that could listen to reason was gone. She put her arm around his shoulders, her touch gentle but firm. "Come with me, Jesse," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur, the one she used for a spooked horse. "Come on, let's go see Solace." She led him out of the cabin and toward the small stable, his steps shuffling and uncoordinated, his body trembling against hers. The morning air was cool and clean, and the familiar, earthy smell of the stable seemed to cut through the lingering scent of fear. Inside, the light was soft and dim, filtered through the dusty slats of the walls. Solace stood in her stall, her white coat almost glowing in the gloom. She turned her head as they entered, her large, dark eyes soft and curious. Eden led Jesse into the stall. The space was small, intimate, filled with the scent of hay and horse and the quiet sounds of a living, breathing creature. "Here now," she whispered, taking her brother's hand and placing it on the mare's warm, solid neck. "Feel that she is not scared. She is here with us." Jesse leaned against the horse, his forehead resting on her powerful shoulder. His trembling was still violent, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Eden moved behind him, wrapping her arms around him, her body a shield against the ghosts that haunted him. She pressed her cheek against his, her lips close to his ear. "Breathe, Jesse," she murmured, her own breathing deliberately slow and deep. "Breathe with me, in through your nose, hold it, and out through your mouth. Listen to Solace. Can you hear her breathing? Match it, she will show you how." The mare stood perfectly still, a warm, living anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. She seemed to understand her role, her very presence a form of quiet therapy. Eden held him, counting the breaths, her voice a soft, rhythmic chant against the terror. 1, 2, 3, 4. She felt the violent tremors in his body begin to lessen. His ragged gasps slowly, painfully, lengthening into deeper breaths. He pressed his face into Solace's warm neck, drawing comfort from the simple, undeniable reality of her. This was not the mine. This was not a dark barn. This was Solace. This was home. The virgin girl, in her pure, unwavering love, calmed her frightened brother. Caleb had been in the paddock, checking for damage from the storm. When he saw them go into the stable, he had seen the way Jesse was moving, and he knew. He had followed, stopping in the wide doorway, a silent spectator to the sacred, private ritual unfolding within. He watched as Eden held her brother, her small frame a fortress of love and resolve. He saw the way she gentled him, her voice a soft, steady rhythm, her body a shield. He saw the magnificent white horse, standing as a silent, patient partner in the act of healing. He was witnessing something profound, something more real and powerful than any land deal or legal battle. He was watching a family being forged in the crucible of trauma, a bond of love so fierce it could stand against any storm, natural or man-made. He waited until the last of the violent shudders had left Jesse's body, until his breathing was slow and even, his head resting peacefully against the mare's neck. Then, Caleb moved. He walked into the stable, his steps soft on the hay-strewn floor. He shrugged off his heavy canvas coat, the one that smelled of leather and sage and hard work. He did not speak. He simply stepped behind them and gently, reverently, draped the coat over both their shoulders, a single warm blanket enclosing them. It was an embrace, a shelter, an unspoken declaration. Jesse stirred, turning his head slowly. He looked from Eden's tired, loving face to the tall, solid figure of the man standing with them in the stall. Caleb looked down at the boy, his rugged face softened by an emotion Eden had never seen there before. His voice, when he spoke, was thick and husky. He was speaking to Jesse, but his words were meant for them all. "This girl," he said, his hand resting for a moment on the coat that covered them both. "She is family to us now. Son, our family." The rich cowboy, with all his land and all his strength, was not offering protection or charity. He was offering belonging. He was calling her family. Then he turned his gaze to Eden. The intensity in his eyes held her, a connection so powerful it left her breathless. He saw the soot that still faintly smudged her cheek, the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes, the fierce, unbreakable spirit that shone from within. He had seen her fight fires and liars and her own demons, all for the love of the boy beside her. "When this all started," he said, his voice a low, earnest rumble, "all that mattered was the land, the lines on a map, the deed to a property. But the world is bigger than that." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "If a man has to choose between all the dirt and all the rivers in the world, and a single, good person, he would be a fool to choose the dirt." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. "I choose the person. Eden, I choose you, forever." He chose her forever. The words, simple and direct, landed in the quiet stable with the force of a prayer. Forever. It was a word that had been absent from her world, a word that belonged to a future she had never dared to imagine. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, shattering relief. She leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement. He closed the small space between them, and she tilted her head up to meet his. He lowered his head, and in the soft, dim light of the stable, surrounded by the smell of hay and the sound of Solace's soft breathing, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but one of deep, quiet reverence. It was hesitant, slow, a question and an answer all in one. It was a promise, a sealing of the words he had just spoken. It was the taste of home, of safety, of a future she had never known she was fighting for. They broke apart slowly, resting their foreheads together, breathing the same air. The whole world had shrunk to this small, sacred space, this sanctuary they had made together. A small, sleepy voice broke the spell. "Are you two going to make Solace blush?" They looked down. Jesse was watching them, a small, tired smile on his face. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a clear, calm understanding. He was not just a boy to be protected. He was a witness to the new shape their lives were taking. Laughter, soft and genuine, filled the stable. It was the sound of a new beginning, a sound of a family choosing itself. Outside, the lights of the distant homesteads began to flicker on, small points of light in the growing dusk. The people of Dusty Basin were settling in for the night, unaware of the quiet, momentous treaty that had just been signed in a humble stable. A treaty sealed not with a wax seal or a legal document, but with a shared coat and a quiet kiss. Miles away, in the dim smoky light of the sheriff's office, Deputy Tom Avery sat alone. He had watched Pike dismiss Caleb, had seen the smug look of corruption on his superior's face. He thought of the Quinn girl's fierce courage, of the terror in her brother's eyes, of the quiet dignity of Caleb Beaumont. He opened the small, leather-bound notebook he always carried, the one where he sketched faces and scenes from his daily patrols. He flipped to a page from a few weeks back. On it was a detailed, nighttime sketch of two men, their faces illuminated by a lantern, pulling up a weathered wooden stake. He had drawn it from memory, a habit he had of recording things that did not feel right. He looked at the drawing, at the undeniable truth of it. He closed the book, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. The time for silent observation was over. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the air washed clean of sand and smelling of damp earth and sage. The quiet in the Quinn cabin was no longer one of tension, but of a deep and settled peace. Jesse was at the table, sketching not from memory, but from life, his subject a small, resilient flower that had pushed its way through the compacted sand near the porch. He was drawing the world again, not the ghosts inside his head. The knock on the door was hesitant, uncertain. When Eden opened it, she found Deputy Tom Avery standing on her porch, his hat clutched in his hands, his young face a roadmap of anxiety and resolve. He looked not like a lawman, but like a boy about to confess a transgression. "Miss Quinn," he stammered, his eyes darting from her to Caleb, who had risen from his chair by the stove. "Mr. Beaumont, can I have a word? In private." They let him inside. The scent of coffee and wood smoke a stark contrast to the cold tension radiating from the young deputy. He walked to the central table and, with a trembling hand, placed his small, leather-bound notebook upon it. "I cannot keep quiet any longer," he said, his voice low and rushed. "What Pike is doing, what Granger is doing, it is not the law, it is a crime." He opened the notebook. On the page was a detailed pencil sketch, rendered with a surprising and damning accuracy. It showed two men, their faces clearly illuminated by a lantern, in the act of pulling up a weathered property stake. "I was on patrol that night," Avery said, his finger tapping the drawing. "I saw them. Granger's men. I have a habit. I draw things that do not seem right. I did not understand it then, but I do now." He reached inside his tunic and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out on the table. It was a copy of a letter, written in Granger's elegant, sloping hand. The words were a cold, clear contract of corruption, promising Sheriff Pike a significant share in the profits from the land acquisition once the railroad deal was finalized, in exchange for his complete cooperation. "Pike is a fool when he drinks," Avery explained, a note of disgust in his voice. "He left this in a file on his desk. I made a copy before he sobered up and remembered it." He had one more item, a small, circular object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a heavy brass seal, its face intricately carved with the same ornate design as the fraudulent wax seal on Granger's map. "I found this in the back of a drawer in Granger's office at the bank while serving a summons on an unrelated matter. He uses it for his personal correspondence. It is a perfect match." He stood back from the table, having laid out the entire conspiracy in sketches, words, and brass. It was the truth, undeniable and ugly. Caleb looked at the evidence, then at the earnest, frightened face of the young deputy. "You have taken a great risk, Tom." "The law is supposed to protect people like this," Avery said, his gaze flicking to Jesse, who was watching him with wide, solemn eyes. "Not serve as a rich man's cudgel. What do we do now?" The answer was not in the sheriff's office or a distant courtroom. The answer was in the town square. Caleb knew that Granger's power was built on a foundation of public perception and intimidation. The only way to tear it down was in public, with the force of the community itself. They went to the inn, where Nora was directing the morning's work with the efficiency of a field general. She listened to the story, her eyes narrowing as she examined Avery's evidence. When they were finished, she did not hesitate. She slammed a fist onto her countertop, making a stack of plates jump. "Enough," she boomed, her voice echoing through the large room. "This town has been silent for too long. We have let a wolf into the sheepfold because he promised us a golden fleece. It is time to find our voices." She untied her apron. "Ring the chapel bell," she commanded one of her workers. "Ring it until your arm falls off. Tell everyone there is a town meeting in the square in 1 hour. A meeting about the future of Dusty Basin." The bell began to toll, not the gentle call to prayer or the frantic alarm of a fire, but a steady, demanding summons that spoke of civic duty and urgent business. People began to emerge from their homes and businesses, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. Nora marched to the chapel and found Father Michael arranging hymnals. "You will be there, Father," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your flock is in trouble, and they need to see their shepherd is not afraid of the wolf." Within the hour, the town square was filled. It was not a mob, but an assembly, a nervous, murmuring collection of ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, and wives. They were divided. Eden could see. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with a lingering suspicion. The promise of the railroad was a powerful lure, and Granger had been whispering in their ears for months. Granger himself soon appeared, with Sheriff Pike at his side. He seemed unconcerned, even amused by the gathering, as if it were a quaint local custom that had nothing to do with him. He moved through the crowd, clapping men on the back, smiling his predatory smile. Caleb stood on the steps of the general store, with Eden, Jesse, and Tom Avery beside him. Mr. Thompson, the lawyer, had ridden in from Cheyenne at Caleb's urgent request and stood ready. Thompson spoke first, his voice calm and precise, laying out the dry, indisputable facts of the territorial land laws, the official survey, and the fraudulent nature of the documents Granger had been using. A low murmur of discontent went through the crowd. Granger, sensing the shift, launched his counterattack. "Friends, neighbors," he called out, his voice rich and persuasive. "Do not be swayed by the words of a fancy city lawyer. He does not understand our needs, our desire for progress." A few men in the crowd, ranchers who held large debts at Granger's bank, began to shout in agreement. "He is right, the railroad will make us all rich," one of them yelled. Another pointed a finger at Eden. "She is the one causing all this trouble, standing in the way of prosperity for all of us. Her recklessness at the mine endangered this town once before. She is a menace." The crowd wavered, the seeds of doubt and greed taking root. They looked at Eden, this quiet seamstress, and saw a threat, an obstacle to their ambitions. Then something shifted. Eden, who had stood silent through all the gossip, all the threats, all the judgment, took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried a weight of truth that made the entire square fall silent. "He is right about one thing," she began, her eyes sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. "I was reckless at the mine. I was a part of what happened that day." She took a deep, shuddering breath and told them everything, just as she had told Jesse. She spoke of her fear, her mistake, and the terrible guilt she had carried. The crowd was utterly still, held captive by the raw, painful honesty of her confession. "I have spent every day since then trying to heal the damage I helped cause," she continued, her gaze finding Jesse, who stood straight and tall beside Caleb. "I have been trying to heal my brother, who has been living in a nightmare of noise and fear. Silas Granger knows this. He knows my brother's weakness, and he used it. He had his men burn my home to frighten us. He had his men kidnap my brother and hold him hostage to force me to sign away my land. This is not about progress. This is not about a railroad. This is about a greedy man who preys on the weak, who uses fear as a weapon, and who believes he is above the law and above common decency." She fell silent, her words hanging in the dusty air. The silence that followed was not one of indecision. It was a profound, collective silence of shame and dawning anger. They were no longer looking at a menace. They were looking at one of their own, a woman who had suffered and fought and told them the unvarnished truth. Into that silence, Tom Avery stepped forward. He held up his sketchbook, showing the drawing to the crowd. "I saw them," he said, his voice ringing with newfound conviction. "I saw them move the stakes. And I saw this." He held up the copy of the letter. This is Silas Granger's promise to buy our sheriff." All eyes turned to Pike. The sheriff's face had gone a dead-on, pasty white. The blood drained from his face, and his blustering composure finally shattered. He saw the ring of hard, accusing faces closing in on him. He turned and bolted, trying to push his way through the crowd toward his horse. The crowd surged after him, a wave of righteous fury. But it was Caleb who moved fastest. He cut through the chaos, his long legs eating up the ground. He tackled the fleeing sheriff in a cloud of red dust, wrestling him to the ground. He did not strike the man. He simply subdued him, taking Pike's own handcuffs from his belt and locking them around his wrists. He hauled the disgraced lawman to his feet and handed him over to Mr. Thompson. "I believe this is a matter for the territorial marshals," Caleb said, his voice cold and final. With their puppet captured and their crimes laid bare, Granger stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. Nora stepped onto the porch of the inn, her voice booming across the now quiet square. "Well then," she said, her hands on her hips, "it seems we need to make a decision. Do we want a railroad that runs on lies and fear, or do we want a town that runs on honesty?" She held up an empty flour sack. "The law says we have a right to petition the territorial government. I say we vote. Let's send a message to Cheyenne. Let's tell them that the people of Dusty Basin will not be bullied." They used scraps of paper from the general store, torn pages from ledgers, anything they could find, one by one. The people of the town filed past, dropping their makeshift ballots into the sack Nora held. Each slip of paper was stained with the red dust of the square, a symbol of a community taking back its power, writing its own future in the very soil they were fighting to protect. As the last vote was cast, Nora looked at Granger with a withering glare. "A railroad is a fine thing." "I suppose," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "but it has no business running through a man's bedroom." A ripple of grim laughter went through the crowd. The tension had broken. The fear was gone. The justice of the people, messy and loud and covered in dust, had won the day. The silence that fell over the town square in the wake of the confrontation was more profound than any noise. It was a vacuum, left where the bluster and intimidation of Silas Granger had been. The vote, counted publicly by Nora and Mr. Thompson, was nearly unanimous. A petition, bearing the dusty signatures and thumbprints of the citizens of Dusty Basin, was dispatched to the territorial capital in Cheyenne with a rider that very afternoon. Sheriff Pike, stripped of his authority and his dignity, was held in his own jail cell until 2 territorial marshals arrived a day later to escort him away. He did not look at anyone as they led him to the wagon, his face a mask of sullen defeat. Silas Granger was not arrested. Not yet. He retreated into his bank, a fortress of brick and glass that suddenly seemed fragile. The investigation, Mr. Thompson assured them, would be thorough, but for all intents and purposes, his reign over the valley was broken. The fear he had cultivated for so long had evaporated in the harsh, honest light of the afternoon sun. In the days that followed, a quiet but profound change settled over the town. It was as if everyone, having stood together against a common threat, remembered how to be neighbors again. The air itself felt lighter, the future less of a threat and more of a promise. On the Quinn homestead, this new sense of possibility took a tangible form, with the threat of foreclosure gone. The work on the well became an act not of desperation, but of creation. They dug with a renewed vigor, and one afternoon, Caleb's shovel hit not rock, but a deep, damp layer of clay. An hour later, the bottom of the hole began to glisten. Water, clean and cold, seeped up from the earth, a miraculous, life-giving pool. The first bucket they drew was a solemn, joyful occasion. Eden held it in her hands, the water so cold it made her fingers ache. She drank deeply, the taste of it clean and pure, a taste of freedom. She watched as Jesse drank, and then Caleb. It was more than water. It was their future, drawn up from the secret heart of their own land. With the well providing a steady supply, the parched land began to drink its fill. Most miraculous of all was the back pasture, the one that had been scorched by the fire. The rain and the ash had worked their own strange alchemy. Tiny, vibrant green shoots began to push their way through the blackened soil, a testament to the land's incredible power of renewal. By the time the first cool winds of late autumn began to blow, the field was covered in a thick, rich carpet of new grass. They harvested it together, working side by side under the warm, gentle sun. The work was hard, but it was satisfying. A rhythm of swinging scythes and the sweet smell of cut hay. They sold the entire harvest to a neighboring rancher, whose own fields had been less fortunate. The sum was more than enough. The following morning, Eden walked into Silas Granger's bank. She did not speak to him, but handed the full payment for her father's loan to a nervous, pale-faced clerk. She walked out with the deed to her land, free and clear, the paper a solid, comforting weight in her hands. The most profound healing, however, was happening inside Jesse. He had found his voice, not just in speech, but on the page. One evening, Eden found him sitting on the porch, a piece of paper in his hands. He was reading aloud to himself, his voice quiet but steady. "I am not the mine," he read. "I am not the darkness, or the roar, or the falling rock. I am not the fire. I am not the ropes. I am not the storm. Those things happen to me, but they are not me. I am the hand that holds the charcoal. I am the one who listens to the horse's breathing. I am the quiet place after the noise stops." He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, a declaration of independence from the tyranny of his own memory. The next week, he went with Eden to the chapel for her lesson with the orphans, while she worked with the older children on their letters. He gathered the younger ones, the ones who were skittish and afraid of their own shadows. He sat them in a small circle and began to teach them, in a soft, patient voice, how to breathe. He had them place their hands on their bellies to feel the rise and the fall. He had them listen to the sound of it, the quiet, steady rhythm of their own lives. He was taking the tool that had saved him and gifting it to others, transforming his own wound into a source of healing. The town, which had once whispered about Eden with suspicion, now spoke of her with a grudging, then open, admiration. The story of her stand in the square, of her fierce protection of her brother, had become local legend. One afternoon, one of the women who had once taunted her at the general store appeared at her door, holding a warm apple pie. The woman's apology was clumsy and halting, but her eyes were sincere. Eden accepted both the pie and the apology with a simple, quiet grace that left the other woman humbled. The old, tangled threads of gossip were being replaced by new, stronger threads of respect. Caleb, for his part, was weaving himself into the fabric of their lives in a way that was both practical and profound. One morning, he arrived not on a single horse, but with two of his ranch hands, driving a small herd of about 20 cattle. He directed them into Eden's newly green pasture. Eden came out onto the porch, her expression a mixture of confusion and amusement. "Are you misplacing your livestock?" "Mr. Beaumont." He smiled, a slow, easy grin. "I have been thinking," he said, leaning against the fence rail. "It is never smart to keep all your assets in one place. A fire, a cattle sickness. It is better to spread the risk. I was hoping you would be willing to enter into a business arrangement. You have the grass and the water. I have the cattle. We share the risk. And the profits, of course." She saw the truth in his eyes. This was not about risk, or profits, or business. This was his way of staying, of knitting their lives together. It was a cowboy's proposal, written not in poetry, but in cattle and pasture land. It was not a promise to take care of her, but an invitation to build something together, sharing the risk. He had called it, not saying goodbye. His integration into their small household was not without its humorous moments. One evening, he was attempting to mend a torn shirt, a simple task that seemed to confound him completely. He held the needle as if it were a branding iron, his large, capable hands clumsy and uncertain. After several failed attempts to thread it, he finally managed to get started, only to let out a sharp yelp, dropping the shirt to reveal a finger with a bright red bead of blood welling on the tip. Eden took the shirt and needle from him, a small, fond smile playing on her lips. You can face down a liar and a cheat in the town square and hog-tie a fleeing sheriff, but you are defeated by a button. She deftly stitched the button back in place, her movements quick and sure. You are a far better man with a Colt than you are with a needle. Caleb Beaumont. He watched her, a look of simple, unadulterated happiness on his face. This was it. This was the life he had not even known he was searching for. This quiet, domestic peace, more precious than all the land he owned. The following weekend, he and Eden rode out to the property line. Together, they pulled up the last of Granger's raw pine stakes. In their place, they drove new markers, fashioned from smooth, pale birchwood that Caleb had cut himself. They worked in a comfortable silence, the rhythmic thud of the post driver a steady, satisfying sound. They were not just marking the boundaries of her land, they were redrawing the map of their own lives, together, on a foundation of truth. As they finished, the chapel bell began to ring, signaling the end of the Sunday service. The sound carried clearly on the crisp autumn air, and Eden noticed it too. It was different. The tone was the same, but the rhythm was slower, more confident. Each peal was allowed to hang in the air a little longer, to resonate more fully, before the next one came. It was the sound of a town that was no longer in a hurry, no longer afraid. In the distance, they could hear the shouts and laughter of children playing in the new grass of a field that had once been ashes. As they rode back to the cabin, Caleb was quiet, a thoughtful expression on his face. "There is one more thing we need to do," he said, his voice serious. "We settled the matter of the land and the law, but we have not settled our own account. Not publicly." "What do you mean?" Eden asked. He looked at her, his eyes warm and full of a quiet, momentous intention. "I need you to come with me to the town square next Saturday," he said. "Wear your best dress. It is time we called things by their proper name, in front of everyone." The following Saturday, as dusk began to settle, the town of Dusty Basin gathered once more in the square. This time, there was no fear, no anger, no division. A quiet, expectant hush had fallen over the community. Lanterns had been lit, casting a warm, golden glow that pushed back the encroaching twilight and softened the edges of the familiar buildings. It felt less like a town meeting and more like a collective, peaceful exhalation. Eden stood on the steps of the general store, the place where the whole ordeal had begun. She wore her best dress, a simple calico of deep blue that matched the color of the evening sky. Jesse stood beside her, his shoulders back, his gaze calm and clear. He was no longer a boy hiding in the shadows of his sister, but a young man standing in his own right. And beside them stood Caleb. He was not dressed in his usual work clothes, but in a clean shirt and a good coat, though his familiar, well-worn boots were still coated in the fine red dust of the valley. He looked out over the faces of his neighbors, friends, and former adversaries. He saw Nora, her arms crossed, a rare, soft smile on her face. He saw Tom Avery, now the town's acting sheriff, looking on with quiet pride. He saw the farmers and ranchers whose lives he had touched, and who had, in turn, touched his. He did not raise his voice to a shout, but spoke in a calm, clear tone that carried easily in the still air. "A few weeks ago," he began, "I rode into this town on my way to somewhere else. I saw a boy in trouble, and a sister who would not let him fall. I figured I would help out for a day, maybe two, lend a hand where it was needed. and then be on my way. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before coming to rest on Eden. But a strange thing happened. That one day turned into a week, and that week turned into something else entirely. I found myself digging a well, fighting a fire, and learning that the most valuable thing in this valley is not the land, or the water, or the promise of a railroad. He took Eden's hand, his large, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I came here intending to help for a day," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, though his words were for everyone. "Today, I am asking for the privilege of helping for a lifetime." A soft murmur went through the crowd. Caleb did not look away from Eden, his eyes holding hers with a profound and steady intensity. He was speaking to her now, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. "I told you once that a man would be a fool to choose dirt over a person," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Between all the land and all the railroads and all the power in this world, I choose the person. I choose you, Eden, forever." The simple, unadorned promise hung in the golden air, more powerful than any legal document, more binding than any contract. Tears welled in Eden's eyes, but she did not look away. She felt the warmth of his hand, a solid, grounding presence. She turned slightly, to include the town in her reply. "A family," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is not a piece of property to be valued or a debt to be paid. It is not something you can buy or steal." Her gaze swept over the crowd, landing for a moment on Nora, on Tom Avery, on the faces of the people who had stood with them. "It is the thing you stand up to protect. It is the people you choose to build a home with, and it is the place where you are safe to heal." As she finished, Jesse stepped forward. He was holding a piece of paper, a new drawing. He held it out to his sister, in his fine, detailed charcoal lines. He had drawn the three of them: Caleb, tall and steadfast; Eden, her hand in his, and himself, standing beside them, his hand resting on the neck of a serene and beautiful white horse. Behind them was the new well, and a field of tall, healthy grass under a wide, peaceful sky. He looked from the drawing to the faces in the crowd, and then at his sister. "People might say that my sister was the cause of a storm long ago," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound confidence that astonished everyone. "But they are wrong. She did not cause the storm. She just had the courage to stand up in the middle of it, and she never, ever let go of my hand." He handed the drawing to Eden, a gift that was both an absolution and a declaration of his own wholeness. As she took it, her fingers brushing his, the sound of an approaching horse cut through the quiet. A lone rider, pushing his horse hard, galloped into the square and reined to a dusty halt. It was the young man who had carried their petition to Cheyenne. He was waving a letter in his hand. "News," he shouted, his voice jubilant. "News from the Capitol. The petition was heard. The Territorial Commission reviewed Mr. Avery's evidence. They have issued a warrant for Silas Granger on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. They are sending marshals to take over the bank's assets until a full audit can be done." A ragged, spontaneous cheer erupted from the crowd, a wave of relief and triumph that rolled across the square. The rider was not finished, and the railroad, he yelled over the noise. "The Trans-Wyoming has officially withdrawn its old survey. They are rerouting the line through the northern pass, far away from any of our homesteads." The cheer that went up this time was a full-throated roar of victory. Justice, which had seemed so distant and unattainable, had finally arrived, not as a gift from a powerful man, but as a direct result of their own collective courage. The next day was Sunday, after the service. The entire town, it seemed, walked together out to the Quinn homestead. Father Michael, his face beaming, stood beside the newly completed well, its wooden frame sturdy and pale against the red earth. He said a simple prayer, not one of sorrow or supplication, but one of profound gratitude. He blessed the well, sprinkling a few drops of its own water onto the wood, a symbol of the town's renewed life. When he was finished, Eden, Caleb, and Jesse stood at the edge of the well, one by one. They took a small coin from their pocket and tossed it into the dark, still water below. They did not speak their wishes aloud. They did not need to. They were for peace, for health, for a future as clear and bright as the sky that was now perfectly reflected on the water's surface. As the small gathering began to turn back toward the town, Nora bustled forward, carrying a large, freshly baked pie, its crust a perfect golden brown. She presented it to Eden with a flourish. "I call this a family pie," she announced loudly. She then turned to Caleb, a stern, mischievous twinkle in her eye. "And you, Mr. Beaumont," she said, poking a finger into his chest. "You had better learn to cut the slices even. It is the first rule for keeping the peace in a new household." Caleb laughed, a deep, happy sound that echoed in the clear air. He slung his arm around Eden's shoulders, pulling her close. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I will do my best." That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, they sat together on the porch of the small cabin. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. In the stable, Solace gave a soft, contented nicker, as if adding her own quiet blessing to the day. The red dust, the constant, indelible signature of the West, still swirled in the breeze, a reminder of the harshness and the beauty of the world they lived in. But inside the cabin, hanging on a peg by the door, was Caleb's heavy canvas coat. It was no longer the temporary possession of a visitor, but a permanent fixture, a silent promise waiting to offer its warmth to a sister and a brother. It was the symbol of a new and sturdy roof, built not of timber and nails, but of courage, healing, and a love that had chosen to stand its ground. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment and tell us where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.